I wanted to talk today about what do I study? Who do I observe? Whose lives do I seek to emulate? There's a verse in Philippians 3, if you want to turn there. It says in verse 17, Paul says, "Brethren, join in following my example and observe those who walk according to the pattern that you have in us." And that really struck me this week. Observe those who walk according to the pattern you have in us. And it made me think there are all sorts of biographies out there. There's all sorts of things that I can kind of be curious about. I don't know about you. I want to know how did Mark Zuckerberg build Facebook? How did Steve Jobs build Apple? How did Thomas Jefferson write the Declaration of Independence? Did he? I think he did. I don't know. Whoever did, how did they do it? Right? How did Abraham Lincoln assemble his cabinet? You know, there's all sorts of things that we can be curious about. And there's many feats of strength and brilliance in the world. And they're all worth prying into in some sense. But the question that came to my mind is, what do I make a habit of looking into? Whose lives do I make a habit of studying? And I want it to be my greatest desire to study the men and women who have surrendered all to God, who've given everything for God, that who, like Paul, can say that they've suffered the loss of all things and count them but rubbish so that they might gain Christ. I was thinking this week, I really want to spend my time looking into the lives of those who walk, as Paul says, according to the pattern that we have in him. It says, he goes on to say in Philippians 4, in verse 1, he says, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, whom I long to see, my joy and crown, in this way stand firm in the Lord, my beloved." In this way. And if you look, what's just come above it is what he said. Observe those who walk according to the pattern you have among us. This is one way I've found to strengthen my faith and resolve, not to compromise amidst the pressures in this world or the distractions, that if I observe those who have walked according to the pattern that we have in the New Testament, saints like Paul, if we observe those who, like Jim Elliot said, right, he's no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Right, Hudson Taylor said, "Lord, you promised I shall never thirst." You know, there are those wonderful missionaries who said, "We died before we ever left." Right, there are these who have counted all things as loss for the sake of knowing Christ. And I find that this, in verse 4:1, that it's in this way I can stand firm. I can strengthen my faith as I look diligently to study and observe those who walk according to the pattern that we have in the Scriptures. There are so many examples for how to succeed in the world. Right, we can look almost anywhere for how to succeed in the world. In Philippians 3 and 18, right after he says, "Observe those who walk according to the pattern you have among us," Paul says, "Many walk, of whom I've often told you and now tell you weeping, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their appetite, whose glory is in their shame, and they set their mind on earthly things." They set their mind on earthly things. And there are many who we can watch and observe who also have set their minds on earthly things. But Paul says in verse 20, our citizenship is in heaven. And and what came to me this week is, since my citizenship is in heaven too, I don't need earthly examples. I need heavenly minded examples that I can look to really seek to grow in the grace of God. And in chapter 4, verse 9, Paul goes on to say, "The things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things." So what that tells me is it's not enough just to observe. As much as I should be diligent to observe, I also need to be putting into practice the things that I see. And if there are things that maybe aren't in keeping with convention or conventional wisdom, modern wisdom, maybe it ought to make me question modern wisdom a little bit, rather than make me say, "Oh, how quaint. That old saint did it that way. He really took God's word seriously there, but now that we're enlightened, we understand that you really can't trust that." No, I ought to practice. I ought to put trust in the pattern. And part of that being proven in my life is that I put these things that I see into practice, and that I humble myself, and that I submit in faith to practicing some things that I see in these people's lives. I wanted to share just one thing that I have to use this same phrase, learned and received and heard and seen in the godly men that I esteem. Specifically as they seek to build the church. We stand on the shoulders of giants, we've heard. And I find that there are, even as I read many saints who've come before, there's very little emphasis on building the church, emphasis that we've been given. And I think it's because there are important emphases that had to be kind of given throughout the ages. But now, I feel that the burden of our hearts here is to build the church, to seek to build the church. And so I want to especially observe the pattern of those who I've learned and received and heard and seen from, who have sought to be building the church. And the one thing that I really feel has been laid on my heart this week as I was thinking about that is the ministry of intercession. That those who seek to build the church seek to emulate Jesus and imitate him in his ministry of intercession on behalf of the body. There's a great picture in Isaiah and chapter 62, if you want to look at it. It's the section of Isaiah which is kind of concerning prophecy regarding the Messiah. And so not all of it, but a lot of it, when you see you can take it to mean the Messiah, Jesus. He has given me the tongue of disciples. I set my face like flint and did not turn back. These are all prophecies concerning Jesus. And in 62 verse 1, he says, which is a wonderful picture of his intercessory ministry. He says, "For Zion's sake, I will not keep quiet. I will not keep silent. For Jerusalem's sake, I will not keep quiet until her righteousness goes forth like brightness and her salvation like a torch that is burning." In the New Living Translation, it says, "I will not stop crying out to God on her behalf until her righteousness shines like the dawn." I will not stop crying out on her behalf. That's the ministry of Jesus' intercession for us. He will not stop crying out until he sees our righteousness shining forth. And then what I was really touched to see is in the same chapter later on, immediately after, Jesus Christ himself posts watchmen to imitate this intercessory ministry. If you look at Isaiah 62 and verse 6, it says, "On your walls, O Jerusalem, I have appointed watchmen. All day and all night they will never keep silent," just like him. "You who remind the Lord, take no rest for yourselves, and give God no rest until he establishes and makes Jerusalem a praise in the earth." Give the Lord no rest until he completes his work. And the question came to me as I've been studying, obviously Jesus is our ultimate example, but also the lives of many men who I believe are consumed with building the body of Christ. I see this ministry of intercession. And the question is coming to me, will I likewise give God no rest until I see the church built? It's a wonderful phrase there. Will I give him no rest? Because Jesus himself says that. I will not keep silent. I will not stop crying out to God on her behalf until her righteousness shines forth like the dawn. There's a great picture of how to do this in Zechariah in chapter 3. I know many of us are familiar with this story, but Zechariah is in the middle of a vision. You think most of the time visions are going to be passive, right? You're observing. You don't really have a role to play in a vision. But there's a great picture of, in Zechariah 3 and verse 3, he sees Joshua standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan's at his right hand, it says in verse 1. And then in verse 3 it says, "Now Joshua was clothed with filthy garments and standing before the angel. He spoke and said to those who were standing before him," the angel did, saying, "Remove the filthy garments from him." And he said to him, "See, I have taken your iniquities away from you and will clothe you with festal robes." So it's amazing that the angel is seeking to remove any impurity that he sees. But then in verse 5, it's really interesting. It says, "Then I, Zechariah, then I said, let him put a clean turban on his head." And I love that. It's like in the middle of a vision, which being a passive observer is okay in a vision, you think. In the middle of a vision, Zechariah can't stop himself. It's like he sees this intercessory ministry. He says, I got to dogpile onto that. I want to imitate Jesus and say, hey, I see this little thing that he's lacking. Interesting that the angel didn't suggest it, right? I see this little thing that he's lacking, and he jumps on. He couldn't help but intercede. And it struck me that Zechariah, who God was stirring up to build the temple, couldn't help himself from jumping in. When he saw a brother lacking, he didn't point it out. He didn't make an accusation like Satan does, you see in verse 1, but he instead join Jesus in the ministry of intercession by seeking God on behalf of something that he saw lacking. I thought, I want to do that too. If I see, I mean, we live in close quarters. We meet regularly. We see each other multiple times a week, many of us, right? Do I see something lacking? What's my response? Do I think I need to address it directly? Do I think I need to make an accusation? Do I fixate on it? Or do I, like Zechariah, eagerly intercede and say, God, give him a turban. He needs a turban in whatever circumstance that, that might mean. Give him a turban. And I really want to prove my love for the church and for my brothers and sisters in the church, specifically by joining Jesus in this ministry of interceding. When I see something lacking, I want to intercede. I want to prove my love by going before God and saying, I will not keep silent, just like Jesus. I won't keep silent until the glory of the church shines forth in all of its radiance. So I've been asking that God would help me to keep such examples of heavenly minded people before me to imitate. The world is always selling formulas for how to succeed on earth, but I want to strengthen my faith, truly strengthen my faith, by seeking out and following godly men and women who are heavenly minded and have given their lives to build the church, and then seek to practice what I see them doing. May God help me.